The year is 1849. In a dimly lit parlor in Paris, the air hangs heavy with the scent of lilies and the shadow of an inevitable end. Here lies Frédéric Chopin, a man who held the heart of an entire nation within the fragile strings of his piano. He was a poet of sorrow, a wanderer in silk, and a prisoner of a memory that haunted him until his final breath. Let us unfurl the velvet curtain and unveil the life of a man whose soul was composed of fire, fragile genius, and a longing that defied the borders of empires. The fragile prodigy. The child seemed to have drifted into this world from a dream, a fragile phantom with eyes that saw too much and nerves that felt the vibration of existence itself. In the quiet Warsaw residence, where winter winds scratched at the frosted glass like beggars pleading for warmth, young Frédéric lived in a realm far removed from the crude reality of his peers. While others sharpened wooden blades to mimic the glory of fallen hussars, Chopin found his battlefield on the ivory rose of a piano. He did not merely play, he wove the rustling of autumn leaves, the sorrow of distant bells, and haunting melodies into a tapestry so delicate it felt as fragile as breath itself. While the afternoon sun beckoned others to the fields, Frédéric retreated into the sanctuary of the music room, where only the ticking clock and the cry of wood under his touch broke the silence. He was possessed by a demon of precision, sculpting sound, until it held the weight of his own heart's anguish. His tutors watched in terror, realizing the boy was sacrificing his vitality on the altar of an art that demanded nothing less than a soul. The Velvet Exile. Fate is a master of cruel irony, and the years in Warsaw had forged Frédéric into the man he had become. He stood at the threshold of maturity, not merely a pianist, but a master whose fingers held the distilled essence. He was ready to conquer the world, his heart brimming. He was ready to conquer the world, his heart brimming, with melodies carved out of the silence of those agonizing nights. But the world outside was crumbling in violent chaos. Poland was a powder keg ignited by revolutionary fire. Warsaw rose against the might of the Russian Empire, a rebellion as desperate and doomed as the cry of a hunted beast. Frédéric watched in horror as his friends, fellow poets, and musicians traded their bows and quills for heavy sabers. He yearned to stand with them, but his hands forged, for ivory keys were deemed too fragile for the weight of a rifle. That belonged not to him alone, but to the very soul of humanity. He stood at a crossroads. Staying meant death or the suffocating silence of oppression. Leaving meant a sorrow that would carve a permanent hollow in his chest. As the streets of Warsaw choked on gunpowder smoke and the screams of his countrymen, the salons where he had played turned into barracks. With a heavy hand, he gathered his few belongings and, as a final act of devotion, filled a silver goblet with the dark, fertile earth of his homeland, a talisman against the oblivion of exile. As the carriage lurched forward, leaving behind the embers of his youth, he knew this was not a tour. He was fleeing the funeral pyre of his world, carrying a phantom country in his heart, destined to become a ghost in the shimmering, hollow halls of the West. The Parisian mirage. Paris in the 1830s was a stage draped in gold, velvet, and the sweet perfume of deceit. The city worshipped at the altar of fashion, and Chopin, with his frail frame and melancholic gaze, became its most exquisite trophy. Yet, behind the shimmer, he was slowly drowning. During the grandest soirees, while the elite of France toasted to his brilliance with crystalline flutes of champagne, Frédéric would often stand by the tall, arched windows. His gaze was fixed not on the ballroom, but on the cold, indifferent stars above. A duchess, draped in shimmering emeralds, might flutter near him, whispering, "Monsieur Chopin, your music is like silk upon the soul." But he barely heard her. Her words were mere static, unable to bridge the chasm between his gilded reality and his haunting memories. In those moments, he was not playing for them. He was playing for the ghosts of his childhood. He felt a desperate, clawing hunger for the scent of a simple, Polish meadow, for the rough hand of a friend, for a language that did not demand the polished masks of a Parisian courtier. He was a prisoner in a crystal cage, renowned, adored, and suffocated by the crushing weight of a home he could no longer reach. The applause roared like thunder, but within him there remained only the hollow, aching silence of exile, the tempest of the heart. Just as the winter in his soul threatened to freeze into eternal frost, she appeared, George Sand. She was no creature of the salons. She was a force of nature. Clad in men's attire, her eyes burning with an intellect that scorched the pretenses of the Parisian elite, she was the antithesis of everything Frédéric knew. She smoked cigars as if burning incense to a new, defiant religion, and wrote novels that shook the very foundations of morality. To Frédéric, she was both a sanctuary and a terrifying storm. In her presence, the hollow silence of his exile shattered, replaced by a chaotic, vibrant pulse of life. She was the only one who saw beneath his velvet mask. She saw the broken boy aching for his homeland and the genius, bleeding his soul out onto the keys. Their love was a landscape of extremes, a romance written in the ink of feverish creation and the blood of mutual exhaustion. She dragged him from the stifling soirees into the solitude of her country estate, trying to cradle his fading life in her powerful arms. Yet she was also his undoing, Her passion was a consuming fire, and Frédéric, with his failing lungs and a heart already brittle as glass, could only endure the inferno for so long before it began to shatter him from within. The Final Nocturne. The final years were not a slow decay. They were a long, melancholic coda. The man who had once set the salons of Paris ablaze with his creative fire was now a fragile flame flickering in the draught of an impending departure. His lungs, worn thin by the tuberculosis that had haunted his dreams for years, struggled to draw breath, yet his fingers, those instruments of divine translation, remained relentless. He spent his final days not in despair, but in a profound, sacred communion with his own soul. He did not crave the gaudy, hollow mourning of the Parisian elite. He wanted the music to do the speaking. As the end approached in his quiet, sun-drenched apartment on the Place Vendôme, the world outside faded into a dim memory. He played his final nocturne, a melody so fragile it seemed woven from moonlight and bitter regrets. When his hands finally fell silent, the music did not end. It merely transcended the walls of his room to echo through the centuries. He had arrived in this world as a fragile phantom, and he left it as an immortal legend. The silver goblet of polished earth, which he had carried across half the world, remained by his bedside, a silent testament to a man who had lost his home, but, in his art, had finally